I'll get it going. We're recording, but we can't see you, so that should be fine. Let's just kick off. Okay, so today we'll be talking about sometimes you kind of get the feeling you've overpromised with your webinar titles. Give your AI assistant LLM superpowers. It's an attractive title, but as you'll see in today's webinar, I'll be talking both about the possibilities and like some difficulties to do this. First of all, I just thought I'd take a moment to introduce myself. And so I asked Copilot, tell me what you know about Jasper Klimbie in 200 words or less. And it came up with a really flattering piece. It said that I'm a versatile professional with a background in law, journalism, comedy, and music. Screenwriting at UCLA and all that good stuff. Helped create the Dutch Google Assistant personality and content. And I worked on a couple of short films. And then I thought I'd have a bit more fun with it. So using this generated text, I asked DALL-E to create a portrait, which is this, who's way more handsome than I am. They got the glasses right, but I would love to have that hair. So funny thing is about this description, about a year ago, I was doing a similar talk, or at least talking about LLMs, and I had the introduction by Copilot, and I had an introduction by Google Bard, and they were both full of factual errors. And as we can see clearly, at least I can see clearly, because you guys don't really know me, but there's no real factual errors in here. So that means that in a year, a lot has happened, obviously, in the LLM world, in the sense that basically everything that's in this description about a random person is now correct, whereas last year a lot of it was completely fabricated and made up. So I think that really shows, one of the many ways that it shows that the large language models that we know have improved a lot. We've all seen the demos and been wowed by the possibilities. But, you know, LLMs are amazingly powerful. You know, these images are in fact 6 or 7 months old, and by now they're like really underwhelming in comparison with what Midjourney and stuff can generate, content they can do. We've all seen GPT 4.0 with Scarlett Johansson's voice apparently illegally used, allegedly, I have to say, before our law firm calls me. But, you know, they can also be amazingly like stupid or wrong, or they can be tricked into like saying really silly things. There's a lot of examples of like really simple kind of language math problems that they keep getting wrong. There's still many remaining ethical questions about which data was used to train them, and who owns that data, and who should be, you know, receiving money when DALL-E creates an image, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So it's still very much, even though for me at least it feels like we've been talking about this forever now, a very much a burgeoning field, right? Nothing has been set in stone, and businesses are really struggling to kind of apply generative AI for business. So here, for example, we have a report on CX Today about McDonald's, who had an AI-powered, generative AI powered chatbot for drive-through orders, which, yeah, we're never sure whether it's actually then tricked into doing things wrong, because most people who are like in this field know how you can kind of mess up a generative AI model. So the AI-powered drive-through, you know, there were a lot of TikToks, including an error that meant $250 worth of McNuggets were added to an order, and ice cream was being confused with ketchup and butter and all that good stuff. So McDonald's was forced to take it offline and is now weighing its options. And in fact, my colleague Jurgen told me that as of yesterday, Wendy's also took their generative order taking chatbot offline because it was doing similar things. So as this article says from TechCrunch, that there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of pressure in companies to get on the AI train, the generative AI train. A lot of prioritization for investment in AI. But oftentimes, and our clients report this to us as well, that it's very hard to demonstrate the value. And it's really hard, and that's the good news for you all, is it's really hard to find talent. So people who actually know what they're talking about when they're talking about generative AI in business applications. So we see this as well. It's like the business case for a classic NLU chatbot is pretty well established. You can do all kinds of calculations on cost and what it's going to deliver. For generative AI, it's a bit cloudy how to realize value there. But still, despite those news reports that companies are struggling to get something from generative AI, just recently this was announced that Vodafone has invested millions in SuperToby. SuperToby is a generative AI version of their existing chatbot Toby. Apparently, in Portugal, which was a lead market, it resulted in first-time resolution rates increasing from 15 to 60% in a specific use case. So, you have lies, and statistics, but so we don't really have a clear view on how much better it is than the existing chatbot. But I think it's probably good enough to justify that investment. So it's happening all over, and this is a good example of adding like LLM superpowers to your chatbot. Let's see. Yeah, I think it's good to take a little step back and kind of compare NLU, so the classic chatbot, if you will, to LLMs. Traditionally, a language model, an NLU chatbot also has a language model. It's a small language model because it's trained on all the data that we've actually put in. So, for example, you might train it on existing customer queries and assign those queries to a fixed set of intents or dialogues or what you will. And so if a customer asks a question, it looks whether it can find an applicable intent. And once it has that, it can push out a pre-designed fixed answer. So that answer, once it's pushed out, it's something that we as conversation designers have written, and it will follow that path. So by now, it feels like almost kind of mechanical. Now, an LLM works differently because the language model is not the language model that we've personally trained. It's the 43 terabytes of language data that the model's been trained on. In this case, this sketch includes reinforcement learning from human feedback. So people have indicated whether things are incorrect or correct. So it has some kind of guardrails in here. And basically, the question is a prompt, and you input it, and it goes to the large language model, and it basically generates an answer. It completes a task. It completes the prompt. Basically, it's a massively complicated language, autocomplete, right? So two very different models, and both of them have distinct advantages and disadvantages. So if you have an NLU with scripted responses, you have 100% predictability in the exact nature of the answers that you're putting out, right? So if you're a bank, for example, everything your chatbot says about credit cards will have been vetted by people who know that the content in there is correct. If you have business critical journeys that need to go through a certain set of steps, for example, in a certain predictable order, you know that it's always going to happen that way. Sensitive topics may need really, really high quality conversation design, for example, like in cases of bereavement or fraud. And you can very easily build multi-step transactional dialogue. So where there's an API call and something actually gets done. With LLMs, they're amazing in being able to kind of create at least an illusion of understanding all the questions, which is a major pain point in NLU chatbots. That customers are always like, it doesn't understand me. I've never heard anyone say about ChatGPT, it doesn't understand me, right? Because it generates an answer regardless of it has no real understanding, obviously, but it always generates an answer. Right? You can do turn-based augmentation, so to get it to be more personalized, and you can use, for example, an LLM as a generative answer as a fallback. So, and one big advantage that LLMs have over classic NLUs is a classic NLU will always look for a question and try to match a pre-designed answer to it, whereas LLMs do better in handling multi-intent questions. And we see that in a lot of business clients we work with, that people do tend to ask multi-intent questions. So that's a real difficult challenge for an NLU chatbot to fix. So where's the difference in practice, if you will? So this is from Microsoft Copilot Studio, a really nice little graph which kind of explains it well. Before generative AI, if you have like on the left-hand scale, it's business criticality. So how crucial is it to our business? And then on the right hand, it's just the number of topics that you are able to build into your chatbot. So if you have scripted responses, they are more and more, the more critical a process or answer is, the more you still would include a scripted response, right? So let's say you're a bank and someone says, I've been robbed, I need to cancel my credit card. You don't want to have a really clear scripted response of what has to happen there. Right? But it's really difficult to just include more and more topics, because the more topics you include, usually you're damaging the performance of your NLU because it can get confused way easier. So there's just basically a cap on how much content you can put in there. Also, having a lot of content means a lot of maintenance. You need to keep track of everything that's in there because you want it to be correct, factually correct and up to date. It becomes a huge content management project. So there's basically just a ceiling of what you can achieve with a classic chatbot. If you use a hybrid approach, I'll explain what I mean with that in a bit. You can really increase the scope of what you can feasibly cover. So you will still have like really business critical journeys, will still be handcrafted and designed and written probably. But you would have a much larger long tail, which you could somehow deal with through generative AI, right? However, this hybrid approach, Microsoft Copilot does it. We work together with a platform called Quick, QUIQ. They have a really advanced RAG solution, which means that the output is grounded in a knowledge source that we know to be correct. So that means that the chatbot has way less hallucinations and is right much more of the time. However, from our experience, it's really not that simple to build. So for a while, there was this kind of last year, there was this illusion that not only do LLM or hybrid chatbots perform way better than NLU chatbots, they're also much easier to build. That's not really proven to be the case, not if you want them to perform very well. Finally, what we really see happening in the market, and some front runners in our business clients are working toward this goal, that if you have a LLM enriched NLU chatbot, it slowly becomes a kind of source of truth for customers, like through your customer facing chatbot, for your employees, like for internal chatbot or internal website resources, for your agents, because they might be using suggestions, AI-powered suggestions when they're helping customers or employees. So it really enriches the experience, and you can use it for all kinds of things, like generated suggested responses for your live agents, summarizing chat conversations, for agents to pick up like asynchronously, or to review, like for your customer service department to see what kind of discussions are we having with customers and how are they going. You might now use NLU and LLM combined to classify intent. And basically, one of the great advantages that we are being promised is that in the end, you will only have one knowledge base that you need to keep up to date. So now many businesses, they will have knowledge resources for the website. They will have separate knowledge resources for the internal site. They will have knowledge resources to support agents, maybe split up between agents that serve employees and agents that serve customers. They will have knowledge resources, which is basically built into your chatbot platform. In other words, they'll be all over the place, and all those different knowledge bases will have to be kept up to date. So that's a real challenge. Okay. So let's talk about 4 common design patterns. Now, this is where kind of the magic happens. How do you combine NLU or classic chatbot and LLMs? Just a small word on that. There we see it very rarely. We've seen many attempts, but a pure LLM chatbot, so where you simply use like ChatGPT 4 and get it to answer questions about your business, or do a really quick, like lightweight RAG solution with some knowledge in which it's grounded, those aren't effective. So you really need to do a bit more work. So one of our banking clients, they do this. They're developing this. They have a really mature NLU powered chatbot with a whole group of like really high quality crafted dialogues in it. And what happens if the user asks a question, the NLU classifier tries to identify intent and serve the created answer. But there's a fallback built in that if it doesn't recognize what the customer is asking, an LLM classifier then tries to match that query to an existing intent. So it's basically just an LLM-powered intent classifier. This works really, really well. In fact, they're considering doing away with the NLU classifier and just using the LLM classifier. Obviously, you can really easily, just by analyzing the results, you can really easily measure which is doing better. For now, they're using a hybrid approach, and they're analyzing it all the time to see what the best approach is. The second kind of hybrid model is using generative answers as a fallback. So if the user would ask a question, and let's say our NLU simply matches a response, and so you go to a scripted response. Let's say I want to order a pizza, and then it goes into a transactional dialogue saying, okay, what topping would you like? Or let's say how do I open a savings account to the bank? And it starts saying that you can open savings accounts in 3 different ways. However, if there isn't an intent matched, then we would go to a LLM-powered generative response, which is then grounded in a knowledge source. So you've probably heard about RAG solutions, and I just want to explain for those who haven't heard about it what it is right here. So a RAG solution is retrieval augmented generation. A simple way of seeing it is that you use the LLM power to generate language, but the content in the language is generated from a fixed set of data, which is your knowledge source. So which might be all your documentation about all the processes in your company. And that means that in theory, at least, the LLM can never really hallucinate. It can't make things up that are kind of not in your documentation or not in your data set. In practice, it can still kind of go off the rails every now and then, but there's all kinds of ways to build in guardrails and stuff, but that makes it like quite an onerous process to get it to work perfectly. But that's, for now, that's probably the most feasible way of using an LLM to talk to customers about your business and your business processes. So a RAG solution. And here we can see this is a really useful hybrid model. You can imagine like all kinds of FAQs going to generated responses that are pulled from your data set, whereas all the important transactional dialogues and informational dialogues that have to be exactly right are addressed from a totally predictable system. So this is, in practice, a really really, really feasible model, which we are seeing in the market already, and which I think will be a very, very dominant model in the coming years. Let's see. Sabrina asked a question. Okay, with the banking chatbot, the LLM gets confused with user queries like, how long are your loan terms? If the bank has more different credit products, it gives an answer from different products, credit website pages, and the answer is mostly not correct. Yeah, that's a really good example of everything we feel at the moment, that everything that has to do with like legal requirements, ideally you would be using informational dialogues that you script yourself. The thing is, it can feel really attractive to do that in your RAG solution, because like it's really text heavy and dense and really difficult to do conversation design on. But we feel that like mostly those kind of legal things are the best addressed by scripted responses. A benchmark on how much it mitigates hallucinations. I don't know. I think our partner Quick has had really, really high percentage results. I wouldn't be able to give any numbers right here on the spot. The thing is, it's always like a discussion that I've had with a number of clients who will say to me, yeah, but our live agents can get it wrong too, right? Every now and then a live agent will make a mistake and tell a customer something that's incorrect. But you know, it's a classic debate. We are, as humans, we are more acceptant of other humans making a small mistake than the robot that we built to make no mistakes, right? So that's really a challenge there. It also, what we've seen, as Willem is saying here, it can really matter how you ground in the RAG solution. And the way you present the information is a big influence. We did a small test, I think somewhere last year, building a little chatbot here just internally to see how a RAG solution would work. It was in the OpenAI ChatGPT builder, where you can build a really kind of simple RAG solution as well, just by uploading some documentation and saying, pull it from that documentation. Really strange. It made a huge difference whether you uploaded a PDF or a doc, and the doc performed way better. Also, I changed, before uploading the document, I changed all the headings into questions, so that if you were scanning through the document, everything was basically presented as question and answer pairs. That also seemed to help the accuracy of the model. So there are some differences, and also platform dependent. Some do better with PDFs, some do better with docs, some do better with Excel sheets. So it's a bit of a black box, really. Okay, let's see here. The next way of doing a hybrid approach is generative answers as a replacement. So here we're seeing the user asks a question. Intent A has a scripted response. Similarly for B, so that might be your loan terms, right? But then intent C, although it's still defined as an intent in the system, so we have still indicated that this is a subject that we specifically want to answer. We might even give a little framework of what the answer should kind of say, but we would leave the actual writing or the generation of language up to an LLM. That way you can really quickly add new content to your chatbot, right? That's because you don't have to go through the phase of having someone like me designing a conversation and writing the prose and having that checked. You could just say, let's say intent C is, what's a good example? Yeah, I'm thinking about the weather report somehow. I don't know why, but let's say it's a hotel group, and intent C is like, what's the average weather in that resort in whatever month? And we would say intent C is about weather in different localities, and then we would add a little prompt there, and it would say, if somebody asks this question, in not more than 100 words, give them a summary of what the weather is like for the applicable month in the area that they're asking about. And the actual content would be generated every time. Okay, let's see, another model, generative answers as a replacement. So this is also something that a couple of our clients are working on. We still use an intent model, but now we have a designed step of dialogue. So we still define the journey. So we have different steps built in. Oops, there we go. Uh-oh. Yeah, this is the one. We still have defined steps, but the language that's created per step is generated. And then also really important is that, let's say we're pulling someone through a sign-up flow. So we're asking them their name and then their address and stuff like that. And then whenever they go kind of off script, we have generative fallbacks, because that's one thing that LLMs do well, is when somebody kind of goes off script, it can still kind of understand what's happening and nudge them back into this flow. Obviously, you can do that as well with scripted responses, but it's just more rigid, so it is more difficult, and you're giving a more disjointed experience by saying things like, sorry, I don't know what you mean. I asked you for your postal code. Please enter it now. Stuff like that. So that it's a bit more clunky. So with generative fallbacks, you can be more flexible and say, yeah, they do have a swimming pool there. Now, what's your postal code again? So that you can kind of still it's almost more like a human-centric way of getting people back into the journey, right? Now, one final thing about all these 4 models, if like a certain solution appeals to you, it's really important, if you already have a platform partner, to discuss with them which ways of doing things are most feasible. For example, like we sometimes, one of our tech partners is Rasa, famous platform, and they have Rasa Calm platform, and that's a really good LLM intent classifier. So in that platform, they've really concentrated. They can also generate content, they told me, but their main focus is on recognizing user questions and then giving out scripted answers, maybe partially generated. But their focus is really on getting that intent recognition better through using LLMs. So just look at, and the big box partners, they will like Microsoft and Google, and they will promise you that they can build anything, and probably they're right. But it's really good to kind of shop around if you have a specific kind of way of creating a hybrid NLU LLM in mind. Kind of shop around and see what suits your needs, right? Yep, let's see. Do you use an automated testing tool to test RAG generated answers? Do you know a design strategy to deal in the best possible way hallucination? Yeah, the thing is, there's not really, the thing is with hallucinations that by nature, it's unpredictable that it's going to happen, because if you could predict that they're going to happen, you would do something to make them not happen, right? So in the McDonald's example, when somebody managed to get the chatbot to be so confused to add $250 worth of nuggets to the order, likely there was no real way of predicting that, because to a degree, hallucinations are kind of an inherent quality of large language model generative AI, because the clue is in the word generative. A generative model will always try to generate content. So we've seen efforts to kind of, like, one of the basic things is to tell in your standard prompt, which is somewhere under the hood, if allow the chatbot to, if it can't find the answer in your RAG documentation, allow it to be able to say that it can't find the answer, right? If you don't allow it to do that, it will always try to generate an answer. And as for testing, I don't know whether we have an automated tool. Maybe Willem can chime in on that. What we do see clients doing is running tests and basically looking at answer questions, question answer pairings, and seeing how well the chatbot performs. But it's a really labor-intensive process if it's not automated. Okay, let's see other questions. Yeah, good question. So in the third example, intent C with generative response. So let's go back one step. That's this one. How do you decide, right? That's a really good question. I'll touch a bit on that when I get to the next slide about implementation. And you're right, your less common, less important intents would be more likely to get generative responses. It's the slide I showed before with the kind of the long tail questions. They would be more likely to get generative responses. So let's say I'm a banking chatbot again, or let's say to change tack a bit, let's say I'm a pharmaceutical and I have a chatbot. Now everything to do with the actual workings of my medical products, I want that all to be scripted. But for example, just anything about like the brand or marketing, or maybe locations where I could get the product or whatever, I might leave that to generation, right? I might just have that generated. Let's see. Yeah, Willem is answering some questions there. It's great. Okay, so let's look at some general, just other use cases that we see in the market. An utterance summarizer. So in some fields, like it's amazed me in our work with clients that customers are really different or speak to companies very differently. Some clients we have, their customers all will basically type in their life story to the chatbot. I've seen I played around with that as well, experimenting with that. If you have an LLM summarize a customer's question, which is if it's longer than say 100 words, and then put it into the NLU model, that it performs really, really well. So LLMs can really summarize quite well, and they will usually summarize to the actual intent that person is typing in. Recognizing multi-intent, I touched on it before. Like people will ask the bank, like I want to cancel my credit card and start a savings account. That's really difficult, right? For a classic NLU chatbot to handle, because it'll either recognize one or the other intent, or neither, and then kind of basically freak out and not be able to answer a question. Test script automation. So if you want to, test your NLU chatbot or test your chatbot, you can generate enormous amounts of content that you can throw in, and if you're clever with coding, you can push that at your chatbot in an automated way to test it easier than was ever possible before. Obviously, coding assistance, writing assistance for conversation designers. Like sometimes you will be asked at a company that you work for as a conversation designer to put something in the chatbot that explains a really difficult process in simple terms. You can ask Gemini or Copilot or one of the others to do that for you, just as a first draft, to see what it does and get a feel for how to explain things really simply. Our CEO, Hans van Dam, has developed an AI-driven quality assurance tool, Codeco, which I'm plugging here. You can use it. Chat Summarizer, we really like it where like let's say somebody has been talking to your chatbot and then it gets handed over to the live agent. It can be really, really useful if before the live agent has to read the transcript, if it's summarized by an LLM, so that they only have to read like 3 or 4 sentences instead of scrolling through a chat conversation like that. Agent Assist, that's basically one of the forms Chat Summarizer could be used for. Having a RAG solution going along with your live agents, so that it reads the customer query whilst the live agent is reading customer query, and then gives the live agent suggestions and resources and links that otherwise they would have to look for themselves. There's a bit of a risk here because the thinking is that your live agent will then, if there's stuff in there that's hallucinated or incorrect, your live agent will always be able to catch that. Obviously, your live agent won't always be able to catch that. And in fact, the more they start relying on these generated suggestions, the more difficult it will be for them to catch incorrect information. So there's a bit of the autopilot effect there, but it can be really, really useful. I've seen some very impressive demos from that. And then your custom copilots and your copilot connectors, that was announced yesterday. It says here that's a bit outdated a couple of months ago. All the things that they are promising us to make our working lives easier. Just being an academic here, I've also kind of starting to see the downside of having, generative AI at your fingertips at large corporations where people depend on writing huge memos to impress their boss. It's become way easier to write a huge memo. And then the boss gets the huge memo and he throws it in ChatGPT and he asks for it to be summarized and reads the summary because he doesn't want to read the whole thing, etc. So there's an ethical kind of business ethical question of whether it's that wise to give everyone in your company access to a huge text generation tool, because emails might be getting longer and longer, and we might end up all using AI to read all the emails because they're just getting longer and longer. But that's up for you. So Willem is still bravely fielding all kinds of questions in the chat. Great to have you on board. Yeah, for Agent Assist, if there's a conflict response between bot and live agent, Agent Assist usually ideally works in the following way. The customer only sees their chat with the live agent, but in their screen, the live agent will see generated content that they can then copy paste into the chat. So they don't see two different things. Okay, so now we've seen a couple of examples. Now that you've seen 4, you can start to imagine different ones. There's all kinds of things possible as long as you can build it. But let's talk briefly about what it takes to kind of implement these things, right? So as I touched on before, it's not easy, right? I at least have been I have been lured into thinking sometimes that LLMs, there's something easy about it. Because when you type in like really complicated, weird, convoluted prompt, it always gives you an answer. So it's like, I'm just one step away from getting this to be awesome for everything, right? So that makes it kind of tempting to think that building it for a business application will be really easy. But as you can see, if you're working at a company that has embraced Copilot, or if you're trying to build an LLM chatbot, it is just simply challenging, right? And it starts off with all kinds of questions like, what language model should we be using? Should we all be using ChatGPT? Should we be using Claude, or should we be using Google, right? If we're creating a RAG solution, what documents or sources of information do we use, right? So do you have information? Like when we built a LLM version of I'm at CDIS services, so we have our own website. I just stripped all the content from the website, put that in a document, first used a PDF, didn't work so well, used a Word document, 56 pages, made some edits in there, and it worked okay. But you can see I needed to pre-process all that stuff. And we're a really small company, so I could do that maybe in a day or two. But do you have up-to-date documents? Do you have a way of managing them? How does the project in general fit with your current architecture, right? Organizational problems. What design patterns do we use, and how to conduct an experiment, right? Oftentimes it's like, especially running experiments can be really, really useful before you just push out the boat, right? So that you know what you have. Really, if this is going to be a big plan, what you're doing, and you're really going to go all in on an NLU LLM hybrid chatbot or an LLM RAG solution, basically you need to do all the pre-work and step back and really have a rethink. Which conversations are you having, right? How many of them are successful? What's currently out of scope? Why is it out of scope, right? Is that something you could outsource to an LLM, or what are the relative costs, right? What is the cost of having it being generated versus doing it the old-fashioned way, or just not addressing it at all? Because that's always also an option, right? Just because a generative model can answer all the questions, do we want to answer all the questions, right? So it's really good to step back and have a think on that. So what we do, basically, we do what we call interaction analysis. So we step back and say, okay, where are all the conversations? We're going to have a good look at them. We're going to group them into issues. And once we have them grouped into issues, we're going to map them to which automation solution we want to have. So pertaining to that earlier question, some we really want to be scripted, right? We want every word in there and every step in the journey to be exactly just so, right? Some we may want to map out the journey, but we're happy for the content, the actual wording to be generated. That's fine. Some we might just be totally fine with them through a RAG solution, a generated answer maybe to an FAQ, totally fine. So we map out where they go. Then we want to really look at, like, what are our current capabilities? What platform do we use? Can we actually do anything with LLMs that fit this mapped idea that we have? And then we need to develop a plan. We need to really make a plan of which steps we're going to do. What I didn't really have in here is, like, do we have the people? I think in the room today we probably have a lot of people who could do these kind of things. But it's really, really good to always take that step back. It's something that we harp on about all the time. It's like, never see it as a really interesting, exciting tech project, but always take that step back and say, okay, which discussions are we having? How do we want to address those? And is this a solution that we want to build, right? Let's field some more questions. This was basically my examples for today. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat. Let's see. Any more questions? Willem's still busy answering your questions, so that's good. New message. Oh yeah, KPIs. Great. So one of the things that as the Gartner article said that I was in the beginning, it's quite hard to define value, right? And one of the reasons it's hard to define value and is that it's not really that clear at the moment how much it's going to cost to build a really, really good NLU LLM hybrid chatbot, or just a RAG solution, a chatbot. The cost side of it is kind of unclear at the moment, right? But what I think are always good KPIs are, like, you once again take that step back. Which discussions are we having? Why? And what do we want to achieve? So your usual KPIs will be things like handover reduction. So you can call that containment, for example, is a really good metric. But I would always also try to include, even though it's so hard to measure, things like CSAT. Channel shift can be a really useful one. For example, in the United States, not so much over here in Europe, but in the US, people are still using the phone a lot to call companies, and it's a really expensive channel. So if you get people to use your chat once and then see that you're retaining them, so they return to the chat instead of going over to telephony, that's a really good KPI. Yeah, so all things that have to do with business value, basically, are really good KPIs that you can steer the ship with. I hope that helped, Sharona. Is it advisable, from Enrique, is it advisable to have a chatbot 100% built with generative AI that handles complex flows such as purchasing products? That's a great question. So once again, like let's say you're a retail business, so purchasing products is like your bread and butter. So it'd be really important to get those right. My feeling would always be that you would at least, at the very least, have to hard code all the steps in your customer journey and design those, right? So to design them and Steve is the Vodafone chatbot guy. Good. We should talk. Is when you design every step of your purchasing flow to make sure that that never like gets weird, right? I do think there are great advantages to having generative AI involved in purchasing flows, because one of the things that like classic chatbots can get confused by is the kind of digressions that people do when they're buying stuff. So suddenly there's, oh wait, I also want to get a pair of socks, right? So, and then basically you've broken the journey. And I think those kind of digression handling is something that generative AI should be able to handle. Let's see, any more questions? Generative AI for HR. That's a great one. So we are actually, with a lot of our clients, we are talking about internal application for generative AI. There's a number of reasons. So one of the things, this may sound a bit cynical, but let's say you have a RAG-based HR chatbot internally, and it gets something wrong, right? There's slightly less fallout usually from it getting something slightly wrong when it's internal than when it's customer facing. We may not all agree on that, but it is a sentiment that I'm hearing. We have a number of clients who are in fact experimenting right now with internal RAG solution type chatbots. One of the advantages that some companies have is that they have all that internal information really well kind of gathered. Especially HR is usually pretty well structured and organized, that information is in a place and it's up to date, and people know where it is so that you can start experimenting with your RAG solution. So I would definitely, that's definitely something that is feasible and in scope. So I would definitely look at that. More questions, good. If a user's utterance contains two questions at the same time with different resolutions, yeah, that's a great question. I don't know what would happen then. I'm going to take that one with me. That's a good question. I think if you have I could imagine if you have an LLM classifier, that it would do something like a rephrase question, saying, okay, I see you have a question about this and about that. What should we start with? So that would be how I would build it, and that would definitely be feasible to build with an LLM classifier. Let's see how LLMs can be used to give more context understanding to an AI assistant. Let's see, how can LLMs be used to give more context understanding to an AI assistant? Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Not really sure about that one, actually. That's a good question. I'll think about that one whilst I feel the next one. How about AI? Let's see. Oh, there we go. AI for archive accessibility. Yeah, it's funny because me and my colleague Jurgen, we recently did a talk about prompt engineering at the Dutch Organization for Archivists. And usually that information, if an archive is well maintained, that information is very suitable to use as a RAG grounding for a RAG solution chatbot. And so definitely, I would definitely have a look at doing that. One of the people who was at that event, they were actually looking at how, for a photographic archive, how they could use AI to find information from that photographic archive more easily, because, as you know, that LLMs can kind of read photographs, right? So if someone would say, let's show me all the photographs you have of like Amsterdam Central Station in the 1920s, They were experimenting with that and getting some promising results. So definitely look at that. It's an interesting use case. Something totally different from chatbots, right? How feasible is it to have a hybrid approach for sensitive topics like health, mental health chatbots? Well, if you look at the market, it would appear that it's very feasible. I think it does require having a lot of guardrails, and maybe having like key things being scripted. But if you look at like some of the market leaders like Wobot, I think they are also experimenting with large language models because it just gives that flexibility of conversations. But you know, it is tricky because it can really, if it goes off script, the fallout is obviously massive. So, okay, lots to talk about. I think I'm going to wrap up a bit. If there's one or two more questions, that's fine. We're 4 minutes to the hour. I hope you all enjoyed it and got something from it. As said, you can rewatch it on the Academy. And if from a professional viewpoint, you'd like to talk a bit more about this or talk about like maybe a challenge that you're having, please reach out to us. You know, we do this all the time and we're discovering this LLM hybrid world as well. And we're gathering learnings all the time. So we'd love to talk to anyone about the challenges that you're having or the experiences that you're having. And you can find me on LinkedIn and reach out to anyone on our team. And I wish you all a wonderful day. And for those of you watching the European Cup, our team can help you. My colleague says our team can help. So how can they reach us? How can they reach us, CDI? Just asking my learned colleague. Through the website, drop us an email, and it's on conversationdesigninstitute.com. And apparently, I have a special offer. I can book you a free 30-minute session with one of our consultants. So maybe me, or maybe someone way smarter than I am, or through LinkedIn. So just feel free to reach out and have a great day. And bon voyage on your LLM adventure. Thanks, everyone.